Hello everyone, and a good Erev Shabbos in honor of Shabbos. This is the fifth in the series of Mincha scenarios, and I want to talk about something that happens on Friday nights around the Jewish world called the 7 o'clock Mincha Maariv. Many communities throughout the summer have Mincha Maariv on Friday night exactly at 7 o'clock. In order to deal with this, let's go back a step. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that with regard to the cutoff time for Mincha, the beginning time for Maariv, there is no psak halacha in the Gemara, and therefore you have to choose for your entire life to either do like Rabbi Yehuda or like Chachamim. If you do like Rabbi Yehuda, you daven Mincha before the plag, and you daven Maariv after plag Mincha. And if you do like the Chachamim, you can daven Mincha until sunset or nightfall, and then daven Maariv from sunset or nightfall. Comes along the Mishnah Berurah and says that at least on one day you shouldn't go ahead and make an inner contradiction. Namely, even if you don't machmir like the Shulchan Aruch, there shouldn't be such a scenario where you daven mincha after the plag saying, I'm a Rabbanan person, and then right when you finish mincha, you'll say, you know what? About face, I'm a Rabbi Yehuda person, I'm going to daven Maariv. So, from this perspective, it's a little surprising. Have an all summer long mincha Maariv at 7 o'clock. It doesn't always correspond, Rabbi Yehuda or Chachamim. Sometimes you're taking Chachamim for Mincha and Rabbi Yehuda for Maariv. So how do we do that? And the answer is that we do have an explicit Gemara that seems to encourage us to do that. The Gemara says in Maseches Brachos, Rav Hatzali Shel Shabbat Be'erev Shabbat, that Rav used to daven the Maariv prayer for Shabbos when it was still Friday, when it was still basically sunlight outside. The Rambam does paskin, that indeed, even though the Rambam's general opinion was that the earliest time to daven Maariv was Shkia, because that was the cutoff time for Mincha, when it comes to Friday night, he says you can actually daven Maariv before Shkia, and indeed explains the Kesef Mishneh. Even though you weren't makpid on the Rabbi Yehuda opinion, namely you didn't daven mincha before the plag and Maariv after the plag, still you can make Maariv early on Friday night, and the Shulchan Aruch, following his words in the Kesef Mishneh, indeed codifies this in the code of Jewish law. You can actually daven Maariv earlier than you usually do during the week, or beplaga mincha, from plaga mincha, you can indeed daven Maariv. Before we go into the reasons, I should point out that the Tur brings the Ritz Geyat that disagrees with this. Because the Jewish people of Paskin like the majority view, which is that you only daven Maariv from the time it gets dark, and Shabbat, you should not daven Maariv early on the eve of Shabbos. There's no early Shabbos according to the Ritz Geyat. And indeed, the Tosefet Shabbat, written by Rabbi Raphael Meislish, is the year 1700 to 1780, rabbi in the Ukraine, comes along and says, in the name of the Ari, that the Ari, Palel Arvit Balayla, Af Be'erev Shabbat, that even on Friday nights, the Ari did not make an early Shabbos. So, even though we do have a dissenting opinion, it seems like a Gemara, a Rambam, and a Shulchan Aruch that says Friday night is different. And the question is, why? Why is it that throughout the week we have to be consistent, maybe for our entire life, or at least on the same day, to either pick Rabbi Yehuda's model or the Chachamim's model, but all of a sudden Friday night the rules change, you can daven Maariv early. And there's three reasons given. Reason number one is the Kesef Mishnah, the Shulchan Aruch. He basically says that according to the Rambam, you never have to be so pedantic with regard to Maariv. When the Rambam brings this law, he actually says that not only can you daven Maariv early on Friday night, he adds on and says, V'chein yitpalel arvit shel motzei Shabbat b'Shabbat, which is exactly what the Gemara says later on that Gemara that we quoted, Lefi shetfilat arvit reshut, and bedaktakim bizmana. Because Maariv is a little less of an obligation than Shachris and Mincha, you don't have to be so pedantic with its time, and therefore the Kesef Mishnah says, when it comes to Maariv, Hu adin b'chol yom, not just on the eve of Shabbos, but any day of the week, lav dafka shel Shabbat be'erev Shabbat. Why? So reason number one is because Maariv is optional. You don't have to be so pedantic with its time. So therefore, you can make it earlier than Shkia whenever you want. Reason number two is more specific with regard to Shabbos. There's a Gemara in Masechet Shabbos Daf Kuf Yud Chet Amud Bet that says, Rabbi Yossi says, I should be like the people that accept Shabbos in Tveria. Tveria was a place that anyone that visits there knows there's hills around it, and it's in the valley, and therefore they didn't know exactly when the sun set. They couldn't see the sun, so they basically accepted Shabbos a little earlier than they needed to because they had a real suffix when Shabbos began. They couldn't see when the sun set. So comes Rabbi Yossi and says, I should be like these people. They accept Shabbos early. Add to this the Gemara in Pesachim Daf Kuf Hey Amud Bet that says, when it comes to Iluye Yoma, when the day begins, Kol ma demakdeminan le adif. As earlier as you can start the day is better. And indeed, putting these two together comes along the Torah and says the reason why you can daven Maariv early on a Friday night is because of the Rabbi Yossi model that said, I'd like to be like the people in Tveria, and like this Gemara in Pesachim that says, when the day begins, we have an interest that it starts early. And indeed, the Mishnah Berurah explains very similarly that because we have a mitzvah, Lohosif Michol al HaKodesh, we have a mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, to defray a little from Friday and to add Shabbos to it, namely whenever Friday is supposed to end, say at sunset, we begin Shabbos a little before sunset. Therefore, it's a good idea to daven Maariv early, because by davening Maariv early, saying Baruch Hu, saying Atat Tidashta et Yom HaShvi'i, you're ultimately fulfilling the mitzvah of Lahosif Michol al HaKodesh, Tosefet Shabbos. So reason number two is we want to encourage people to do Tosefet Shabbos. One of the ways to do it is to daven an early Maariv. The third reason is a very novel reason of the Magen Avraham. As everybody recalls, our sages patterned Maariv based on the parts of the animal that, while sacrificed during the day, certain parts called the Evarim Upedarin were actually burnt the night after. So say it was a sacrifice that was brought on Thursday, it was these parts of the animal, the Evarim Upedarin, were burnt Thursday night. However, says the Magen Avraham, based on the Gemara in Shabbos, on Daf Kaf Daled Amud Bet, that's only all week, but not burn Friday night, the parts of Friday. Olat Shabbat b'Shabbato, says the Gemara, v'lo olat chol b'Shabbat. Based on that, basically, there was no Friday night Maariv, quote unquote, because there was no burning of the animal Friday night. They had to burn it before Shabbos began. And based on the model of Korbanot, which is the way we modeled our times of davening, we have to daven Maariv early on Friday night. So according to the Magen Avraham, it's not a convenience thing, but rather it's actually mi'ikar hadin, because the korban's parts were not burnt on Friday night after dark. We don't daven Maariv after dark. So three reasons why you could have an early Shabbos on a Friday night. Number one, says the Kesef Mishneh, you can do it all week because Maariv is optional. Reason number two, we have a specific interest, Lohosif Michol al HaKodesh, on a Friday night. And number three, because on a Friday night they did not burn those parts called the Evarim and Pedarim, simply because you couldn't do it on a Friday night. You had to do it earlier for the Korbanos of Friday.